Welcome to another quick edition of the RevGEN podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about event management for revenue managers, and we're going to give you 4 tips on how you can better manage major events at your hotel. As usual, let's do a quick intro and break down what kind of events we find have the biggest impact on hotels that revenue managers need to be paying attention to. So this week we've got Hudson joining us. Hudson is a revenue analyst here at RevGEN who manages several very event-heavy markets. So he's had to learn a lot about event management in a short period of time. So Hudson, what are some examples of events that revenue managers might need to keep that close eye on?
One of the major events that we have here is football games, both NFL and college. Most of our markets are actually very heavily affected by college football. And as we know, those are very, very big demand drivers for the fall semester. And, they can really make or break a year, depending on how well that you strategize for those events.
Nice. And I'm glad that you brought up football because actually I'm going to link below a whole case study that we did on how to manage NFL games and how revenue managers can maximize their performance over NFL games. But it also applies to college games as well. And we break it down all the way. So we look at, how you should manage it if the kickoff time is, early, late, what day of week that the game falls on. So again, we'll link that below. So Hudson, what is another example of an event?
Another major kind of event would be trade shows or conferences. We will start seeing these pop up more and more with COVID slowing down and life coming back to normal as we see it. May not be the same effect as we had in years past, but definitely these are going to start showing up more. These kind of events can offer significant sustained demand across multiple days and can affect how you host these events, depending on where your hotel is in proximity to the event center, conference center, whatever the case it may be.
Okay. And lastly, another kind of event might be what I would call those miscellaneous or even, act of God events. So for example, in 2024, in spring of 2024, we have a really, really big eclipse that's coming, and sounds kind of funny, but that's actually going to be a really, really big event for those hotels that are in the path of that eclipse. Also too, on the negative side of things, you have things like hurricanes and tornadoes and floods, and we obviously don't want to see those things happen, but from a revenue management perspective, those are events and that they can be major, demand drivers. They can also negatively impact your demand in lots of different ways. So those also have to be considered events. So let's get into our 4 tips for how revenue managers can better manage their major events. Hudson, do you want to go ahead and take tip number 1?
Yeah. My first strategy is shop the compset. For me, I have 2 very heavy football markets, but they both operate very differently at the same time. And this will give you kind of a good starting point with indication on price, just like a general starting point. Do you need to add length of stays? Is that kind of a big factor? And then what cancellation policies need to be made? I have one market where it's prepaid, non-refundable, and I have other markets where it's, 7-10 day policy. So a lot of those can really affect how you start your events. The other thing to keep in mind is, as the season progresses and the better your team gets, the more demand will come with that as well. The better your team does, the more demand. The worse it does, the demand is probably going to slow down with it. And the other factor that I think people do forget about is certain teams travel very well, and it doesn't matter how far and wide, whether it's from here in Dallas to Philly or, pick a city. Some teams travel really well, and it is something you do need to keep in mind.
Okay, here's my tip. This is tip number 2. Historical performance can give you key insights. So if you have a big concert coming up and you have historical performance for other similar events, you should definitely use it. So most events have distinct and somewhat predictable demand patterns. So one example that I like to use is AT&T Stadium here in the DFW Metro. So if a big, Taylor Swift concert gets announced, not only has she already performed here in years past, but we can also look at other similar events like a Beyonce concert or George Strait concerts. And by looking at those, we can really get a feel roughly for how this event's going to perform. So use this historical data to price and yield and push for better performance this time around.
My third tip for events is using what the brands provide for us. Majority of the brands provide some sort of how-to for just building out events, and then also, what rate codes and rate plans to keep open. Like I said, it's very, very basic, but it gives you a very good starting point, especially if you don't have any historical data to start with, or it is a new type of event in the area. It gives you pretty much a good starting place for it. And a majority of the time, it just keeps open, bar rate or rack rate for brand.com, Booking, and Expedia, just to get you started. And I think the basic government rate too for a majority of those plans. The other thing to keep in mind is some hotels do need a little bit more open from the get-go. For example, one of my hotels, they get a lot of hospital rates, so we like to keep that open on events just because it is a big draw for us. And the rates do come in pretty good as well, so that's why we like to keep it open.
Our fourth and final tip is to watch rate evolution. So one of my biggest secrets with event management is to always watch rate evolution to learn how the compset moves rates over time. One of my favorite tools ever is OTA Insight's 30-day rate evolution tool within Rate Insight. Just by looking at that, you will realize how the compset prices leading up to arrival. And what you'll find is that most compsets move in highly predictable but ultimately inefficient ways. So I actually wrote another case study on this, and it actually looks at how the New York City market manages leading up to New Year's Eve. And the results were actually very shocking. So knowing how your market prices for events can give you the confidence to hold firm on rate when you know it's appropriate, or you can also drop a bit to build some base. So that's all for this week. Keep an eye out for new episodes coming soon. Thanks for listening.